I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been recovering from surgery.
Prince George was only trying to enjoy a quiet moment in the royal gardens until Queen Camilla's voice, sharp and unmistakably cold, shattered it. Witnesses say his smile faded instantly, and by the time Catherine saw her son's trembling hands, it was too late. Whatever Camilla had said left its mark. But it wasn't just a passing remark, it was a turning point. What did the Queen Consort say that drove Catherine to the edge? Stay with us, because what happened next shook the palace in ways no one expected. Catherine's instincts go on high alert. It was supposed to be a charming, ordinary spring gathering, polished and pleasant, like most royal functions meant for public goodwill. St. James's Palace was dressed to impress. Crystal glasses gleamed under soft lighting, tulips stood in perfect formation, and the hum of refined conversation filled the grand reception hall. Yet even as Catherine made her rounds, graciously greeting school patrons and nodding at ministers, her thoughts drifted again and again to her son. George had started the day quieter than usual. No tears, no tantrums, just a stillness that didn't sit right. At breakfast, he'd pushed his plate around more than he ate. He wasn't anxious. He rarely was before public appearances. But there had been something else, a hollowness behind his usual sparkle. Catherine had chalked it up to nerves and helped him straighten his collar before sending him out with his siblings for a brief role in the event. Nothing too official, just a few handshakes, polite smiles, and photos before they were to be ushered back to the drawing room. The king had insisted it was important for the young royals to understand their roles early on. Catherine had agreed, but only with careful supervision. Everything, as always, had been timed to the minute. George had been placed alongside two young heirs visiting from European royal houses, just a light, symbolic chat meant to show unity. Catherine had observed from the doorway as he spoke about his love for history. He'd been composed, engaged, and almost back to his usual self. But then, Camilla entered the room. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voice, no sharp gestures. Just a glance at George, a moment so small most would have missed it. But Catherine didn't. She caught the way her son's shoulders stiffened, the way he sat a little straighter but avoided looking up. Something had changed. She tried to shake it off as she moved through the event, shaking hands and thanking donors. But years inside the palace had sharpened her instincts. Catherine had seen before how subtle comments dressed up as polite corrections could cut deeper than anyone admitted. And Camilla, ever poised in her pale blue coat dress, had a reputation for saying the unsayable with a smile. As Catherine moved down the west corridor, a flicker of motion pulled her gaze. George stood alone, head lowered, shoulders tight, his lips drawn into a pale, uneasy line. No tears, no tantrum, just a quiet ache written across his small frame. Catherine's steps faltered, and the world around her dimmed into silence. Her son, the heir to the throne, looked like a boy trying to shrink into nothing. Something wasn't right, and whatever had just happened, someone would answer for it. The moment everything changed. But just as Catherine turned from the west corridor, still weighing what she'd seen in her son's face, she noticed George again, this time standing utterly alone by the stone column outside the music room, his posture guarded, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't looking around, he was just still, and for George, that was unusual. For a child so naturally curious and full of quiet charm, silence like that didn't come without a reason. He didn't notice her at first, but she could see the way his shoulders had tightened, the same way they had earlier when Camilla entered the room. Catherine followed the subtle trail, her eyes flicked toward the arched hallway, just as Camilla disappeared around the corner, sipping water as if nothing had happened, calm, composed, almost too much so. That was when the suspicion sharpened into certainty. Something had happened in that room, and now, looking at George, Catherine could see the evidence in every small detail. His usual poise, the kind that earned him praise from school staff and palace aides alike, had hardened into something else. He wasn't sulking, he was retreating, keeping something in. Even that morning, there had been signs. At breakfast, he'd barely touched his toast, didn't joke with Charlotte, didn't ask William questions like he usually did. When she gently asked if he was all right, his just tired reply had felt empty, delivered without conviction. She didn't push then. But in the car, the silence deepened. Charlotte and Louis, bright and bubbly, had kept themselves entertained with nursery rhymes and giggles. George, though, stared out the window, eyes following the rooftops, as if trying to lose himself in them. Catherine had watched him in the rearview mirror. He wasn't anxious. He was distant. At the palace, it only got worse. He followed instructions, smiled on cue, but it all felt mechanical, like he was mimicking rather than participating. He didn't rise with the other children. He only moved when prompted, and he avoided lingering glances at any adult, especially Camilla. Catherine recognized that kind of withdrawal, not in George, but in children carrying more than they could say. So when she found him again outside the music room, face blank, eyes unfocused, her heart caught in her throat, she walked to him, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He barely lifted his head. But she felt it, the tautness beneath his stillness. Not quite fear, but close. This wasn't just quiet, it was concealment. She wouldn't let him carry it alone. Sliding her hand to the small of his back, Catherine turned toward the music room. Whatever had happened, whatever was being hidden, she was going to find it. But what do you make of a mother who doesn't need proof, just instinct, to know her child's in trouble? Keep watching, because what she discovers next changes everything. When silence spoke louder than protocol. The corridors were quiet, the kind of quiet that made Catherine's steps feel louder than they were. She'd told a nearby aide she needed to check on the children. Not that anyone would question her. Catherine's involvement with her kids wasn't just habit, it was instinct. And right now, every part of her was telling her to find George. She moved toward the eastern wing, sunlight spilling in through high windows, warming the walls, but doing little to calm the sudden chill she felt. As she neared the music room, muted voices drifted into the hall. She paused. One of them was Camilla. The Queen Consort's tone was even, too even, carrying that faint, polished sharpness she used when correcting others without appearing unkind. "George, darling," she was saying, "there's a time to speak and a time to listen. We mustn't always make it about ourselves." Catherine stood motionless, just beyond the half-open door, her pulse quickening. Then came George's reply, quiet, unsure. "I thought it was okay. He asked what we do to help schools, so I said—" "You were very sweet," Camilla cut in too quickly. "But sometimes it's better to let the adults carry the conversation." There was a pause, long enough. Catherine stepped inside. George was standing near the piano, hands tightly clasped, his expression locked somewhere between confusion and embarrassment. Camilla stood nearby, sipping from a crystal glass with a faint, practiced smile. Catherine walked over without a word, placing a hand on George's back. He leaned toward her, the tension in his shoulders betraying everything he hadn't said aloud. Camilla glanced over, her voice airy. "We were just chatting." He had a lot to say. He was invited to share, Catherine replied, calm but unwavering. And he answered with honesty, "I won't have that shamed." Camilla raised an eyebrow. Children can sometimes overstep without realizing. It's important they learn humility. Catherine's gaze didn't shift. Confidence isn't arrogance. And I won't have my son made to feel small for speaking when spoken to. George remained silent, but his eyes lifted toward his mother now, searching her face. She knelt beside him. "Did you feel like you made a mistake?" she asked softly. After a long pause, George gave the faintest nod. Her jaw tensed. Rising slowly, she turned to Camilla one last time. "Correction has its place. But belittling a child isn't something I will tolerate." Without waiting for a reply, she guided George from the room. Her steps were quiet, but every one of them carried a promise. As they moved down the corridor, the soft hum of conversation and clinking glasses faded behind them, but George's quiet stillness said more than any words could. The truth beneath Prince George's silence. George walked beside Catherine without speaking, his eyes distant, caught somewhere between the moment and the memory. She didn't ask anything yet. Instead, she gently guided him toward a smaller, unused sitting room tucked near the east wing, a place wrapped in calm, far from curious eyes. Once inside, George sank into the velvet seat near the window, his gaze falling on the gardens outside. Catherine sat beside him, waiting, not pressing, just present. Eventually, her voice broke the silence, low and warm. "Do you want to talk about it?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I said something about helping schools if I ever became king. People laughed, but in a nice way, I think." Catherine listened, eyes steady. "But afterwards," he continued, "Granny Camilla said I was acting like I knew everything, that people don't like that in children." He paused, then added, almost whispering, "She said I sounded arrogant." The word lingered in the air. Catherine gently placed her hand over his. "That wasn't arrogance, George. That was honesty, kindness. And no one should make you feel small for that. Not ever." And what do you think triggered Catherine to finally stop smiling and start drawing lines in silence? Keep watching to find out. A quiet line, drawn by Princess Catherine. Even as Catherine exchanged polite smiles in the palace reception hall, she could sense the tension simmering beneath her skin, a tension she'd mastered hiding in public but refused to ignore any longer. Outside, the photographers were already angling for the perfect shot through the trellis, entirely unaware of the quiet fracture unfolding within. It wasn't the first time Camilla had offered her usual passive digs. Remarks dressed as tradition, delivered with the poise of experience but soaked in something far less kind. This time, though, it wasn't directed at Catherine, it was George. And that changed everything. Earlier that day, after the youth roundtable, Camilla had pulled the boy aside and scolded him, told him not to be arrogant, that no one liked a child who spoke too much. Catherine hadn't needed George to explain. She caught the tail end of it herself. What hurt wasn't just the words. It was the shame she saw in her son's eyes afterward, the way he questioned if he'd done something wrong simply by speaking his mind.
Say hello. Hi. That looks delicious. What happened to this one on the floor?
That night, when the children were tucked in, Charlotte humming under her breath, Louis gripping a toy knight, Catherine found William buried in briefing notes. "It happened again," she said flatly, settling into the armchair without preamble. She told him what she'd seen, how George had felt. William looked stunned, anger slowly creeping into his expression. "She always makes it sound harmless," Catherine said quietly, "but she's never gentle with them. Not really." William asked if he should intervene. Catherine shook her head. "Not unless she does it again. I want her to know I saw it, that I'm not pretending anymore." She didn't raise her voice, didn't ask for permission, just laid it down, steady and calm, the kind of calm that came not from indifference, but from certainty. She was done excusing it. Later, as she peeked in on George asleep, peaceful at last, she stood in the doorway a moment longer. Years of royal decorum had taught her to bend, but tonight had shown her something different. When it came to her children, she'd no longer bend, she'd stand. The day the line was drawn. The conversation had barely ended when Catherine felt the quiet churn beneath her calm. William had stepped away to handle press matters, but she remained in the room, her fingers lightly curled around George's shoulder, grounding both herself and her son. Across from them, Camilla adjusted a brooch, her voice dripping with that familiar tone that always carried more than it claimed. It wasn't loud, wasn't cruel, but it landed all the same. A remark about confidence turning into arrogance. A reminder that heirs should listen more than they speak. George had nodded politely, but his eyes had gone dim. No one watching from the outside would have noticed. The photographers, setting up just beyond the garden trellis, were preparing for another picture-perfect image. Smiles, handshakes, all the royal choreography in place. But inside, something had shifted. Not just because of what had been said, but because of who had heard it. The car ride back was filled with soft chatter from Charlotte, who hummed a tune she'd picked up at the event. Louis clutched a tiny knight, reliving imaginary battles from the exhibit. George remained quiet, pressed to the window, his silence not brooding, but bruised. Catherine didn't prod. She recognized that look, processing, not pouting. Later that evening, once the children were asleep and the palace had settled into its familiar hush, she found William in the study, still reading over briefings. The moment she entered, he knew something had shifted.
It's so weird.
weird when they get bigger to think that they were that tiny.
Is everything all right? He asked, setting down his folder. No, she replied without pause. She didn't circle the topic, didn't hesitate. Camilla pulled George aside again, she said plainly. Told him he talks too much, that people find it irritating. William's eyebrows drew together slowly. Did George tell you this? I walked in just as she was finishing, Catherine replied. He confirmed it later. Thought he'd embarrassed us. William didn't speak for a moment, just let out a slow breath and rubbed his forehead. That's not acceptable. It's not, Catherine agreed. And it isn't the first time. They both knew it wasn't. The quiet jabs wrapped in pleasantries, words that could be dismissed as innocent unless you knew how often they repeated. Always just low enough not to cause a stir, never loud enough to accuse. She's always measured with adults, Catherine continued, her voice low but steady. But she's never extended that same care to the children, especially not to George. William offered to confront her, but Catherine shook her head. Not yet. I want her to know I saw it, that I heard it. She needs to understand the line's been drawn. He studied her, perhaps expecting more anger or hesitation, but Catherine's calm wasn't born of restraint. It was earned, the kind of stillness that follows years of keeping quiet, of letting things slide for the sake of peace. If she crosses it again, William began, but Catherine cut him off with a soft certainty. She won't. No raised voice, no drama, just finality. She stood and quietly returned to the children's hallway. George was already asleep, his face smooth again, the crease in his brow gone. Catherine lingered by the door for a moment, then turned and walked away. Not in defeat, but in quiet resolve. And what do you think happened after Catherine's silence shook the palace? Stay tuned. This calm was only the beginning.
Having been lucky enough to meet some of our country's amazing charities and organizations.
Princess Catherine's quiet revolt. The night had been long. By the time they returned to Adelaide Cottage, the children's laughter had given way to sleep, and the hallways were hushed beneath dimmed chandeliers. But Catherine remained wide awake, her thoughts not agitated, but sharpened with purpose. Her heels barely made a sound as she moved through the rooms, not aimlessly, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had seen just enough. When she paused at George's bedside, brushing a hand through his hair, the decision had already been made. The furrow in his brow hadn't relaxed completely, even in slumber. Whatever had been said to him, whatever tone had clung to those words, was still echoing. By dawn, the calls began. One to the palace office first. George would not be attending the upcoming Youth Environmental Showcase. His throat was a little raw. Technically true, but that wasn't the reason. Catherine wasn't about to let her son sit through another event curated by Camilla's circle, where subtle jabs were dressed up as guidance and politeness masked something colder. She'd seen it before, gentle nudges that dimmed confidence, critiques that arrived in the form of compliments, and the pressure to smile through it all. Of course, word got around faster than she hung up the phone. By noon, one of Camilla's aides had already inquired informally about George's absence. Catherine offered no clarification. Let them wonder. Later that evening, while dressing for a separate engagement, Catherine overheard a member of the household staff relaying a remark from Camilla. Something about George being perhaps a bit too delicate for outdoor engagements. Catherine didn't flinch. She thanked them, offered a soft nod, and went on with her schedule. But beneath her poise, something shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't send a statement. But she drew a boundary so clear, so unmoving, that even the palace walls seemed to realign. In the days that followed, there was a noticeable change. Conversations among staff grew more measured. Reports were double-checked. Briefings took a cautious tone. Catherine hadn't issued a warning. She was the warning. William watched quietly, not because he was indifferent, but because he trusted her lead. That night at Highgrove, when her voice had cut through the silence like glass, he hadn't interrupted.
The abiding affection I feel for it is rooted in my experience of its everyday life.
His support came not in speeches, but in stillness, and when they revisited the moment days later, He simply said, "You were right to say it." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The true measure of her stance came the next morning. George stood straighter, joked more freely with Charlotte, and carried himself without the quiet hesitation that had crept in. That was what mattered. Catherine had long understood that royal life demanded a delicate balance. Appearances mattered. Silence was sometimes a strategy. But motherhood demanded something deeper. It demanded the courage to stand firm when others smiled, and the grace to protect without spectacle. And now, the message was clear. She wasn't shielding her image. She was shielding her child. The quiet divide at Balmoral. Balmoral had always felt like a retreat. Open hills, muddy boots, and moments where the royal family could pretend the world wasn't watching. Charles cherished it. But this summer, the atmosphere carried a quiet tension. Catherine had agreed to come, but only on one condition. George must never be left alone, not even for a moment. William and Catherine arrived first. Camilla followed later, pleasant as ever, pearls perfectly in place. Though she smiled often, her words with Catherine were brief and cool. Still, George seemed to blossom at Balmoral, climbing trees, chasing squirrels, asking endless questions about birds and bugs. Catherine, watching from a distance, allowed herself a flicker of hope. On the fifth afternoon, Charles and William had gone fishing. Catherine stayed inside, reviewing correspondence with Lady Celeste. The children, she believed, were in the garden. So when a footman casually mentioned, "Prince George is in the sunroom with Her Majesty," something in her froze. She stood, nodded politely, and walked without a word. Outside the sunroom she paused. Camilla's voice drifted through the partially open door, gentle but edged. "George, curiosity is lovely, but future kings must understand that not everyone cares what they think. I'm only trying to help, darling. Sometimes your mother forgets what's proper." Catherine pushed the door open. Camilla turned, blinking. "Oh, Catherine, I didn't know you were—" "I was looking for George," she said softly. The boy stood by the window, eyes low. "Well, you found him," Camilla replied with a brittle smile. "I have." Catherine crossed the room and placed a hand gently on George's shoulder. "Could you check on Charlotte and Louis for me?" He nodded and slipped out, silent. As the door clicked shut, Catherine turned. Her voice was calm but firm. "You may not agree with my parenting, but don't ever speak to my son about what I've forgotten. Not again." "It wasn't a criticism." "It was," she said without flinching. "And it stops here." Camilla didn't respond. Catherine gave a small nod. "Kindness is enough. If that's too much, distance will do." Then she left, quietly but absolutely. After that moment, Balmoral carried a new rhythm. Camilla remained cheerful, still laughing over lunch and discussing garden plans. But she no longer offered advice. She no longer corrected. And most importantly, she never found herself alone with George again. The family photos at summer's end told a different story. Polished smiles on the castle steps, coordinated tartan, unity on display. But inside, the lines had shifted. Later, back at Adelaide Cottage, George slipped into his mother's room. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, curling beside her. She wrapped an arm around him. "Not even close." He looked up. "You stood up for me." She smiled gently, brushing his hair back. "I always will." But what do you think it means when Catherine dares to draw the line, even against royal tradition, for her son's self-worth? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.